God, country, and family are the cornerstones on which especially the far-right dictatorships of the 20th century base their power. Three words: a trinomial, the homeland, the value of homeland, patriotism, and so on. The family is seen as a bulwark against negative values coming from other social models, and God, in the sense of religion, mainly understood as the Christian religion. But has it really always been like this? Was the God referred to by the Nazi fascist dictatorships of the 20th century really the Christian one, or even Catholic doctrine? Maybe it wasn't exactly like that, and so today we will investigate this particular relationship between the Nazi fascist dictatorships and the Islamic religion. A very complex relationship of converging interests, with periods of rapprochement and periods of conflict between a secular power, the political one, and a religious power. Both saw opportunities in several directions to strengthen their ties, convenient alliances, which then led to shocking outcomes, or in other cases to grotesque results. Our story has a precise date from which everything begins: March 17, 1937. We are in Libya. Libya, for several years now, has been part of the Italian colonial empire. It was theoretically conquered after the end of the Italo-Turkish War, the War of 1911-1912, the war in which Italy experimented for the first time with the use of airplanes in combat scenarios. The war in which Italy took advantage of a dying empire, the Ottoman Empire, to try to expand its own colonial empire. In reality, the war ended much later, with the full conquest at the beginning of the 1930s, after the defeat of the Islamist guerrilla led by Omar al-Mukhtar, the Lion of the Desert. Only from that moment on, and at the cost, moreover, of severe losses, especially among the civilian population, decimated by reprisals, disease, hunger, and the use of concentration camps along the coast. Only from that moment on was Italy truly able to get its hands on Libya, without, however, seizing the real hidden treasure: oil. And this is quite amusing, but why? I'm talking about March 17, 1937, because on that day, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini went to Libya to inaugurate the Balbia Road, the great coastal road built by Governor Italo Balbo, and therefore dedicated to him. For this reason, Balbia, which crossed the entire Libyan coastline from Tripoli to the Egyptian border, a great work, as we would say today. And during the visit for the inauguration of the Balbia, a Berber chief, acting, as he said, in the name and on behalf of other desert tribes, he had offered Mussolini the so-called Sword of Islam, the scimitar, the classic blade weapon of the Maghreb, a sword, in quotes, sacred. The Berber chief, handing it to Mussolini, who, satisfied and pleased, had unsheathed it and brandished it in public. That Berber chief had called Mussolini a friend of Islam, protector of Islam. From that symbolic gesture, from that famous Sword of Islam, the fascist regime had drawn strength from this to try to forge an alliance, essentially, with Sunni Islam, present especially in Libya, but also in other parts of its own empire. Think of Eritrea or Somalia. It was not the only idea developed by a far-right regime in Europe during that period. Think, for example, about what would happen shortly after in Germany, where, starting from the uprisings in the mid-1930s, in the British Mandate of Palestine, Hitler, the Führer, had begun to form initial alliances with figures, including the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haji Amin al-Husseini, whom we have already talked about. You can find a video about him on the channel. This relationship, the supposed natural alliance between totalitarian regimes and the Muslim world, was actually extremely contingent, pragmatic, and deeply political. When people talked about God, country, and family, especially in Italy and Germany, the issue was already more nuanced. More than one person could have raised their hand and said, "Excuse me, but which God are we talking about?" Because still under fascism, in 1929 the Lateran Pacts were signed, the agreements that were supposed to put an end to the long-standing Roman question, the dispute that had lasted for over half a century with the Vatican for purely political and practical reasons, the state of the Church, which had been reduced to the so-called Vatican, so much, much smaller compared to its initial possessions, as the papal state, the need to compensate the Pope for the losses suffered, and so on. This geopolitical variable, in reality, of the dialogue between fascism and later also Nazism with the Islamic world was simply an attempt to destabilize what were the natural enemies of totalitarian regimes, that is, Western democracies. So let's broaden our perspective. When in 1830 the French were the first to set foot in the Maghreb and conquer Algeria, they found themselves dealing with a society very different from French society at the time. A tribal society governed mainly by delicate relationships between the various tribes, between the various clans, and obviously united by the faith in Sunni Islam. This was something that put the French to the test during the subsequent conquest. Tunisia, Morocco, with an agreement with the local sultan, and then further down below the Sahara, the sub-Saharan belt, and the English themselves who had intervened, also coming down from Egypt along the Nile. Think about the video we made some time ago, dedicated to the Mahdi and the Holy War at the end of the 1800s. So they too had to deal with a conception of the world within Africa that was not only political and social, but also religious and in a different way. French and French. Having addressed the issue, the French, historically, have always felt closer to the Levantine Christians, to the populations, for example, of Lebanon, to the Maronites, to the Greek Orthodox, of whom they had been the traditional protectors against the Sublime Porte, that is, the Ottoman Empire. The English had preferred dialogue with all the different religious denominations, and had supported from time to time the various national movements, starting with the Arab one, also focusing on the need to rediscover a different sentiment. Relying no longer on the Turks, who historically are usurpers, but rather on the old tribes who guarded the holy places of Islam. When these totalitarian regimes emerge between 1920 and 1935, well, little by little, everyone has to deal with Islam, especially in an anti-French and anti-English way. Italy, colonial troops in Libya, as well as in Eritrea and Somalia, actually face the problem of coexistence between the so-called national soldiers, that is, Italians, and the national officers. With the native troops, the so-called Bokbashi are created, that is, the colonial non-commissioned officers, who are Eritrean, Somali, and Libyan. How is loyalty to Italy and the fascist regime ensured among these soldiers who come from the colonies, if the English and the nationals targeted who? On the possibility of maintaining their own cultural, religious, and social identity with incentives, think of Nigeria, or on the possibility of obtaining full citizenship, as in the case of the French. Italy also relies on the leverage of Islam, granting freedom of worship, obviously in Libya and in the other colonies. It gives the theoretical possibility of making a career within the army, but it's very theoretical. It doesn't go any further. Respect, however, is guaranteed. This is testified by another protagonist from another one of our videos, whom we've already met, the Major. And then Lieutenant Colonel Castagna, the commander of the Sarabub stronghold during the World War II, Castagna reveals something enlightening in his diaries. The loyalty of the Libyan soldier to the Italian flag is good, but the Libyan understands that it isn't really so. A stepmother, as she had been portrayed by the Turks, who had also incited the Libyan rebellion by appealing to their shared Sunni Islamic faith. Castagna reveals that the Libyans welcomed Italy because they understood that with Italy they could have a dialogue, that Italy did not come to impose new customs, new traditions, or a new religion, and that Italy also gives something in return. There is the classic issue, however, And Castagna writes this in his diaries. The Libyan has his own customs, and these customs can no longer be respected. The Libyan might even decide that Italy is fine, but there are other issues. Castagna gives a very simple, down-to-earth example. In the Maghreb, drinking tea is a custom, especially for a specific reason. The water from the wells is considered drinkable only after being boiled, mainly to avoid problems like botulism. So they drink tea, but what if there is no sugar? If Italy doesn't provide it? Put in a position to fight for Italy, to wear its uniform, to swear allegiance to the flag, the king and the douche? Maybe not. And so here another fact emerges. Convenience. The convenience that was pursued from 1932 until the fall of Libya throughout the entire colony. Starting from the 1930s, after the capture and execution of Omar al-Mukhtar, the regime developed a policy of apparent respect for Islam. They talked about Jarabub. Jarabub was a reinforcement, a fortified oasis, but it was originally established as a center of worship. The fascist regime, for example, financed the restoration of the Jarabub Mosque and many other mosques, not only in those outposts where it was not possible to have a civil magistrate. The fascist regime recognized the validity of Islamic courts for matters related to family law. It may seem minor, but for Libyans, this matters. In addition to all this, the Berber chiefs and notables, especially those of the Senussi sect, who openly show loyalty to the regime. Fascism grants lines of credit, economic support, money. Simply put, this policy adopted by the fascists did not imply religious pluralism, but aimed only at one thing: to neutralize Islam as a potential autonomous force opposing the regime itself. It was better to integrate this force, better to give it the illusion of still being part of a common path. And this includes that staged event on March 17, 1937, the spectacle of the Sword of Islam, which was trumpeted and publicized through newsreels and photos in the newspapers. The propaganda at that time presented Benito Mussolini as a defender of Muslim religious traditions, an opponent of alleged Anglo-French oppression, as if Egypt were not just a condominium between Egyptians and the English, in perfect equality, and not an oppressive regime. Leader Mussolini, capable of dialoguing with the Islamic world, but who was he actually talking to? Beyond some Berber leaders and a few notables, Mussolini had no relations with the Saud family, who had expelled the Hashemites as custodians of the holy places like Mecca and Medina, and even less with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who instead turned to Adolf Hitler. This narrative, rather makeshift and designed specifically to present Mussolini as a protector of religions, first of the Catholic religion and then of Sunni Islam, had a dual purpose. On one hand, to strengthen colonial control, and on the other, to project Italy as a leading power in the Mediterranean, a Mediterranean that, by necessity, on various shores, coincided with the Arab world. While this kind of policy was being pursued in Rome and Berlin, as we have already partially seen, there were clear contradictions in the racial ideology, and not only that, promoted by Nazism towards Arab irredentism and the religious extremism of figures like Haji Amin al-Husseini. In Berlin, Islam was seen precisely as a weapon against the British Empire, a weapon to be exploited to try to stir up discontent in the colonies managed by the British. The idea was to use Islam as a tool for destabilization even later, on the Soviet front as well. We must not forget that in the Caucasus, but even more so to the east, beyond the Urals, large Islamic communities, mainly Sunni, but also some Shia, could theoretically be sensitive to this issue. We have seen how the relationship between Hitler and Haji Amin al-Husseini led to the creation of a Waffen SS division, the Anschar, which is the German name for it. But beyond this, we have really seen little of what could have been, but in the end did not happen. Rather, fascism, Italian fascism, which operated in a direct colonial context, unlike Germany, which had lost its colonies in Africa and elsewhere after the Great War, sought a more explicit symbolic legitimization, arriving at the pantomime of the sword of Islam. On the contrary, Nazism had a factual, almost fragmentary approach. It tried to make friends with the few leaders, with the few individuals who could have some influence, but nothing more. But this alliance, the alliance between Nazi fascism on one side and Islamic extremism on the other, is an extremely difficult alliance, sometimes even impossible. Let's remember, in fact, that within the Muslim world from the 1920s until the end of the 1940s, at the beginning of the 1950s, the fragmentation of political groups and also, conversely, religious groups was enormous. Leaving aside that very particular case, which is Lebanon, which we have talked about many times in various videos you can find on the channel in almost all Arab communities, the division was evident among different lines of thought. Islamists who supported the French or the British, Islamists who instead preferred a moderate path to independence, Islamists who wanted to take up arms against the British and the French, but not on behalf of the Italians or the Germans, or Islamists who openly sided with the Axis, hoping it could become a sort of liberating tool and then lead to full independence. In the end, however, this relationship between the dictatorships and Islam, a part of Islam, was a meeting of pure convenience. We can't talk about shared values. Fascism and Nazism used religion for political purposes every time. Mussolini used the Lateran Pacts to settle the issue with the Catholics and start bringing them over to his side instead of having them as critics in his own house. And when the time came for Islam, he did the same, taking part in some staged events, only to help his regime have greater control over the territory, minds, and hearts. Hitler did something different. He somehow encouraged rebellion and the possibility of becoming soldiers of the Nazi German Empire, simply for anti-English purposes. He was interested in that, not freedom of worship. Islam, which was never a strictly ideological partner, was rather the object of manipulation, control, or attempted control, exactly as happened with all other religious traditions when they came into contact with totalitarian regimes. Does it still work today? Look at what's happening. For certain churches, for denominations that bend to the wishes of certain autocrats, it's exactly the same thing. But understanding this story, the story of the Sword of Islam, the story of March 17, 1937, the story of the supposed love of fascism towards Islam, and, even before that, of the Catholic religion, helps to avoid anachronistic interpretations. It generally recognizes how totalitarianism, as a doctrine, tends to systematically systematize and empty a religion of its own spiritual content. Totalitarianism, on the other hand, is a doctrine, not a religion. And as a doctrine, it only seeks means of transforming power in order to perpetuate that power, extend it, guarantee it, and make it ever stronger. It doesn't care about anyone. It doesn't distinguish between an intimate, personal, religious, spiritual, even esoteric belief, if you will, and mass rallies, public declarations, oaths of loyalty. Everything is fine. Everything adds up. And that's what was seen in Italy as well between 1929 and the Second World War, if you want another proof. For a long time after the fall of fascism, after the end of the Second World War, after the closing of the colonial period and the liberation of the colonies, in Somalia, as well as in Eritrea, many former subjects of the fascist empire remained intimately, and in some ways unconsciously, tied to the fascist background. Partly because they had grown up with that imprinting, and partly because they had fallen under the perverse charm of a protection over their own beliefs, their own essence, their own society, thinking that Mussolini could be, I wouldn't say the Messiah, but at least a benevolent protector. Only many years later did these communities open their eyes and realize they had been deceived. The irony of fate with all pacts with the devil. At first, it seems like you've made a good deal. After a while, some people understand and realize they've been deceived. Others feel nostalgic, thinking that after all, things weren't so bad under the devil. Only in the long run, by weighing the pros and cons, and the pros are very few while the cons keep increasing, Only then do you realize you've made a terrible mistake. To trust in a deadly embrace, an embrace between a religious belief, it is a political doctrine that has no interest in preserving the individual's privacy. It wants him standardized, regimented, gathered in massive assemblies or within divisions ready to fight for a threefold creed: God, homeland, and family. And whether the God is the Christian God or the Allah of Islam, well, it doesn't really matter. The important thing is to have subtitles ready to die for the only God that matters, the dictator of the moment.